The silver behemoth sliced through the azure sky above Tokyo, a glint of defiant American might against the backdrop of a city bracing for its doom. It was a B-29 superfortress, a symbol of the relentless aerial campaign that was slowly strangling Japan. But this one wouldn't return to its Pacific Island base. Mechanical failure, or perhaps something more sinister, had crippled the giant, forcing it down into enemy hands. Its capture was a propaganda victory, a brief flicker of hope in a darkening landscape. Autumn, 1944. Tokyo was a city of stark contrasts. Crumbling wooden houses huddled in the shadows of belching factories, each working tirelessly to feed the insatiable maw of the war machine. Air raid sirens wailed with increasing frequency, a constant reminder of the B-29s that haunted the skies. A palpable tension hung in the air, a mixture of unwavering nationalistic fervor and the gnawing dread of impending defeat. Everyone knew, deep down, that the tide had turned. The glorious victories of the early war years were distant memories, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. In the heart of this turmoil was Captain Masaru Tanaka, a brilliant but tormented engineer in the Imperial Army. Driven and ambitious, he carried the weight of past failures heavily on his shoulders. Early in the war, his designs had been deemed inadequate, costing lives and stalling crucial offensives. This perceived inadequacy fueled his relentless pursuit of excellence, a desperate attempt to prove his worth to the emperor and to himself. His patriotism was intertwined with a growing sense of dread, a fear that Japan's technological inferiority would ultimately lead to its downfall. News of the captured B-29 rippled through the military establishment like an electric current. Here was an opportunity, a chance to dissect the enemy's technological prowess and turn it against them. Tanaka was summoned to headquarters and presented with the task: examine the captured aircraft, understand its secrets, and find a way to neutralize its threat. The sheer scale of the task was immediately apparent. The B-29 was almost entirely intact, a gleaming monument to American ingenuity. Its size, its complexity, its sheer power, it was unlike anything Tanaka had ever seen. He walked around the massive aircraft, his mind racing, trying to grasp the enormity of the challenge. Every rivet, every wire, every piece of advanced machinery seemed to mock Japan's desperate attempts to keep pace. The initial goal was simple: decode the B-29's technology, understand its strengths, identify its weaknesses, and develop countermeasures. But a more ambitious plan was already taking shape in the minds of the high command. A plan so audacious, so fraught with risk, that it would either save Japan or hasten its destruction. Project Kurohane, Project Black Feather, was born. A top-secret initiative to clone the B-29, to create a Japanese strategic bomber capable of striking back at the heart of America. The very idea seemed insane, a fantastical dream in a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. But desperation breeds audaciousness. The initial assessment was sobering. The B-29 was far more advanced than anything Japan possessed. Its engines, its navigation systems, its radar, all were years ahead of Japanese technology. The scale of the project was daunting. It would require immense resources, skilled labor, and a level of technological expertise that Japan simply didn't have. Despite the overwhelming odds, Tanaka vowed to succeed. He would pour all his energy, all his intellect, all his very being into this project. It was his chance to redeem himself, to prove his worth, to save his nation. He would not fail. The weight of expectation, the fear of failure, and the burning fire of national pride propelled him forward. He would unravel the secrets of the B-29, even if it consumed him in the process. If you want to join Captain Tanaka and his team as they embark on this monumental task, hit that subscribe button. Follow the journey of Project Kurohane and discover the incredible challenges and impossible choices that lay ahead. Tanaka knew he couldn't tackle Project Kurohane alone. He needed a team, a group of individuals as dedicated and driven as himself. He meticulously handpicked engineers, scientists, and factory workers, each chosen for their specific skills and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. There was young Kenji, a prodigious mechanical engineer with an uncanny ability to diagnose engine problems, the stoic and methodical Dr. Akari, a brilliant physicist specializing in aerodynamics, and Old Man Sato, a master craftsman whose hands could coax impossible shapes from sheets of metal. He trusted these people with his life and with the fate of Japan. The reverse engineering began in earnest. The B-29 was disassembled piece by piece, its components laid out like a dissected animal on the factory floor. Every bolt, every wire, every circuit was scrutinized, measured, and documented. The team worked tirelessly, poring over blueprints, struggling to understand the intricacies of American technology. The engines, in particular, proved baffling. Their sheer power and complexity were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The wing design, with its complex internal structure and advanced airfoil, was another major hurdle. But the war cast a long shadow over Project Kurohane. Japan's resources were dwindling, and the relentless bombing raids disrupted production and morale. Materials were scarce, skilled labor even more so. Often, the team had to scavenge parts from damaged aircraft or improvise solutions with inferior materials. Air raid sirens frequently interrupted their work, forcing them to scramble for cover in underground shelters. The constant threat of destruction hung over them, a grim reminder of the stakes involved. Early attempts to replicate key components met with failure. The engines sputtered and died on the test stand. The wing prototypes buckled and twisted under stress. Frustration mounted, and doubts began to surface. Some team members whispered that the task was impossible, that Japan simply lacked the resources and technology to match the Americans. Tanaka, however, refused to give in. He pushed his team harder, demanding more effort, more ingenuity, more sacrifice. Tanaka's single-minded focus often brought him into conflict with his superiors. They demanded immediate results, tangible progress, anything to show for the massive investment in Project Kurohane. Tanaka argued for a more methodical approach, emphasizing the complexity of the task and the need for thorough research and development. He knew that rushing the project would only lead to more failures, but his superiors were impatient, driven by the desperate need for a game-changing weapon. As Project Kurohane progressed, a disturbing suspicion began to creep into Tanaka's mind. That information about the project was leaking to the Americans. The bombing raids seemed to target key facilities involved in the project. American propaganda broadcasts hinted at knowledge of Japan's efforts to clone the B-29. The possibility of a mole within the team loomed large, casting a shadow of distrust over everything. Tanaka ordered a discreet investigation, determined to root out any traitors. The immense pressure and long hours took a heavy toll on Tanaka and his team. They worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a desperate sense of purpose. Exhaustion gnawed at them, blurring their vision and clouding their judgment. Stress and anxiety became constant companions, amplified by the growing awareness of Japan's increasingly desperate situation. Some team members succumbed to despair, questioning the point of their efforts in the face of inevitable defeat. Despite the setbacks and challenges, the team achieved small victories. They successfully replicated some of the B-29's smaller components, such as its landing gear and hydraulic systems. They managed to improve the efficiency of their machine tools and streamline their production processes. These small breakthroughs provided a temporary boost to morale, a reminder that progress was possible, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The team would celebrate with sake, sharing stories and boosting morale for the challenges ahead. The B-29's wing continued to be the bane of Project Kurohane. Its complex structure, the intricate network of spars and ribs, and the advanced aluminum alloys used in its construction were far beyond Japan's current metallurgical capabilities. They could analyze the wing, measure it, even understand its aerodynamic principles, but replicating it with available materials proved to be an exercise in futility. Every attempt resulted in a heavier, weaker, and ultimately unusable structure. To solve this seemingly insurmountable problem, Tanaka brought in Dr. Ito, a brilliant but eccentric aerodynamicist from Tokyo Imperial University. Ito was a visionary, a radical thinker who challenged conventional wisdom at every turn. He had a reputation for unconventional methods and a disdain for bureaucratic red tape. His office was a chaotic mess of papers, models, and half-finished inventions. Tanaka, a man of rigid discipline and order, found Ito's personality grating, but he couldn't deny the man's genius. Ito was their last hope. Ito dismissed the idea of simply copying the B-29's wing design. He argued that Japan needed to adapt the design to its own resources and capabilities. He proposed radical changes, suggesting the use of wood and bamboo in the wing's construction, reinforced with strategically placed steel supports. He even experimented with unconventional airfoil shapes, pushing the boundaries of aerodynamic theory. Tanaka was skeptical, but he allowed Ito to proceed, knowing that they had nothing to lose. After weeks of intense work, the team built a full-scale prototype of Ito's wing design. It was a strange and ungainly structure, a patchwork of wood, bamboo, and metal. But it was also a testament to Japanese ingenuity and resilience. Excitement rippled through the factory as they prepared for the initial stress tests. The wing was mounted on a massive steel frame, and hydraulic jacks were used to simulate the forces of flight. Everyone held their breath as the pressure slowly increased. The wing creaked and groaned under the strain. The wood splintered, and the bamboo supports began to buckle. Suddenly, with a deafening crack, the wing failed. The prototype collapsed in a heap of twisted metal and shattered wood. Tanaka's initial doubts were confirmed. Ito's radical design, while innovative, simply couldn't withstand the forces of flight. The team was demoralized. The failure felt like a crushing blow, a sign that Project Kurohane was doomed. Tensions rose between Tanaka and Ito, the clash between pragmatism and unconventional thinking reaching a boiling point. In the aftermath of the wing failure, a troubling discovery was made. A critical support beam had been deliberately weakened, its metal subtly scored with a sharp tool. It was sabotage. Someone had intentionally caused the wing to fail. The hunt for the mole intensified. Tanaka launched a secret investigation, questioning team members and scrutinizing their movements. The atmosphere in the factory became thick with suspicion and paranoia. Trust evaporated, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Tanaka began to suspect a close member of his team, someone he had known and trusted for years. The thought was almost unbearable, but the evidence was mounting. He wrestled with his conscience, torn between his loyalty to his comrades and his duty to his country. Internal conflict threatened to tear Project Kurohane apart from the inside. The consequences of failure became ever more apparent as the war worsened. American bombers pounded Japanese cities with impunity. The nation's infrastructure crumbled, and its people suffered from starvation and disease. The team felt the weight of their responsibility to Japan's survival. They knew that if Project Kurohane failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The weight of expectation pressed down on them, threatening to crush their spirits. The dream of a Japanese superfortress faded, replaced by the grim reality of impending defeat. Tanaka moved in the shadows, a ghost within his own project. The sabotage had shaken him to his core, not just for the setback it represented, but for the profound breach of trust it signified. He couldn't openly accuse anyone, not without concrete proof. So he observed, listened, and subtly investigated. Late at night, after the weary workers had shuffled home, Tanaka would pore over records, cross-reference logs, and piece together fragmented conversations. He watched for inconsistencies, for nervous glances, for any sign of guilt. The truth, when it finally emerged, was a bitter pill to swallow. The mole was none other than Hiroshi, a quiet, unassuming engineer who had been with the project since its inception. Hiroshi had always been a loyal and dedicated worker, but Tanaka discovered a hidden layer of disillusionment beneath his placid exterior. Intercepted letters revealed Hiroshi's growing despair over the war's brutality and his belief that Project Kurohane was only prolonging the inevitable suffering. He saw the project not as a means of salvation, but as a tool of destruction, another cog in the war machine. He'd been feeding information about the project, including details about the wing's weaknesses, to American contacts through a clandestine network. Tanaka confronted Hiroshi in the dead of night, inside the cavernous factory. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, the silence broken only by the distant hum of machinery. Hiroshi didn't deny the accusations. He simply stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. He explained his motivations, his growing moral revulsion at the war's senseless violence, and his belief that Japan was on a path to self-destruction. He saw his actions as a form of resistance, a way to hasten the war's end and prevent further bloodshed. The standoff was tense, the weight of their shared history and conflicting ideologies hanging heavy in the air. Tanaka, torn between his duty and his personal feelings, ultimately had no choice. Hiroshi was a traitor, and he had to be dealt with accordingly. He was arrested, his fate sealed by his own conscience. The revelation of Hiroshi's betrayal sent shockwaves through the team. Trust, already fragile, shattered completely. Paranoia festered, and suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor. Tanaka struggled to maintain order and focus. He addressed the team, acknowledging the betrayal, but urging them not to let it derail their efforts. He emphasized the importance of their mission and the need to remain united in the face of adversity. But the damage was done. The sense of camaraderie had been poisoned, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Despite the setback, Project Kurohane pressed on. They salvaged what they could from the wreckage of the first wing prototype and began work on a modified design. This time, they took a more conservative approach, focusing on strengthening the existing structure and using more readily available materials. They incorporated some of Dr. Ito's ideas, but with a greater emphasis on practicality and reliability. The second prototype was built with meticulous care, every joint reinforced, every stress point carefully analyzed. The second wing prototype performed better than the first, but it still fell short of the required strength. It could withstand greater pressure, but it eventually succumbed to the same forces that had destroyed its predecessor. The team was disheartened, but they refused to give up. They analyzed the failure, identified the weak points, and made further modifications. The military, however, was growing impatient. They demanded results, threatening to shut down Project Kurohane if significant progress wasn't made soon. Tanaka found himself at a crossroads. He was torn between his loyalty to his country and his growing doubts about the project itself. He began to question the ethical implications of cloning the enemy's technology. Was it right to simply copy the B-29 to adopt its methods and strategies? Was there not a better way to defend Japan, a way that didn't involve replicating the instruments of destruction? He confided in Dr. Akari, seeking her counsel. She listened patiently, but offered no easy answers. She reminded him of the desperate situation facing Japan and the need to explore every possible avenue of defense. The external pressure mounted. Military officials visited the factory, their faces grim, their voices laced with thinly veiled threats. They made it clear that Project Kurohane was on its last chance. If Tanaka couldn't deliver a working bomber soon, the project would be terminated and resources would be diverted elsewhere. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Tanaka, threatening to crush him. He knew that the fate of Project Kurohane, and perhaps even the fate of Japan, rested on his shoulders. He had to find a way to succeed, even if it meant compromising his own principles. Facing the imminent demise of Project Kurohane, Tanaka felt the cold grip of desperation tighten around his heart. He had exhausted every conventional approach, every logical solution. Now only radical measures remained. With a heavy heart, he conceded to Dr. Ito's most extreme proposals. Ito, ever the iconoclast, had been waiting for this moment. He unveiled his kamikaze wing design, a horrifyingly elegant solution born of desperation. It was a lightweight wing, stripped of all unnecessary reinforcement, designed for maximum speed and maneuverability, but at a fatal cost. It was engineered for a one-way mission. The design was predicated on a grim calculus. Reduce the weight of the wing, increase the bomber's speed, and load it with explosives. The cloned B-29 would become a guided missile, a suicide weapon aimed at American warships or strategic targets. It was a terrifying concept, a perversion of engineering brilliance. Tanaka was repulsed. The idea of deliberately sacrificing pilots, of turning a magnificent aircraft into a tool of self-destruction, violated his deepest moral principles. But he was also a soldier sworn to defend his country. And in his twisted logic, he saw it as the only way to salvage Project Kurohane, the only way to potentially strike a decisive blow against the enemy. The kamikaze wing ignited a firestorm of debate within the team. Some, hardened by the war, saw it as a necessary evil, a sacrifice for the greater good. Others, like Dr. Akari, were vehemently opposed, arguing that it was a barbaric and dishonorable tactic. The team fractured, divided by conflicting ideologies and the weight of impending doom. Tanaka, wrestling with his conscience, listened to the arguments with a growing sense of dread. He knew that approving the kamikaze wing would stain his soul forever. But he also knew that failure meant the end of Project Kurohane, the loss of countless lives, and the potential collapse of Japan. The power of desperation, the relentless pressure from above, and his own twisted sense of duty ultimately swayed his decision. With a trembling hand, Tanaka authorized the construction of the third wing prototype, the kamikaze wing. The factory floor transformed into a scene of frantic activity. The team worked around the clock, driven by a mixture of fear, desperation, and a morbid fascination with the task at hand. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a sense of foreboding hanging heavy in the air. The team members, already exhausted and demoralized, pushed themselves to the limit. They skipped meals, sacrificed sleep, and neglected their families. They were haunted by nightmares of fiery crashes and wasted lives. But they continued to work, driven by a sense of obligation, a belief that they were playing a crucial role in Japan's survival. Tanaka carried the weight of his decision like a physical burden. He knew that he was sending young men to their deaths, transforming them into human bombs. He tried to rationalize his actions, telling himself that it was a necessary sacrifice, that it was for the good of the nation. But deep down, he knew that he was crossing a line, sacrificing his own humanity for the sake of a desperate cause. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were filled with the faces of the pilots who would fly the kamikaze bomber, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He saw himself in them, another pawn in a game he no longer understood. He was caught in a web of his own making, trapped between his duty and his conscience. He could only hope that his sacrifice would be enough to turn the tide of the war. The kamikaze wing, a grotesque parody of aerodynamic ingenuity, was finally complete. It was a skeletal structure, a web of thinly shaved wood and hastily welded metal, barely capable of supporting the weight of the aircraft, let alone withstanding the stresses of flight. It was a testament to desperation, a symbol of Japan's dwindling resources and fading hope. The wing was carefully attached to the cloned B-29, transforming the majestic bomber into a flying coffin. The aircraft was then moved to a remote airfield, far from the prying eyes of enemy reconnaissance planes. Preparations for the first test flight began immediately. Finding a volunteer pilot for the test flight proved surprisingly easy. There was no shortage of young men eager to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. They were indoctrinated from birth to believe that death in service to the nation was the highest honor, a gateway to eternal glory. One pilot, Lieutenant Kenzo, a quiet and unassuming young man with a steely gaze, was chosen. He understood the risks involved, accepted his fate with stoic resolve, and prepared himself for the ultimate sacrifice. He wrote a farewell letter to his family, expressing his unwavering loyalty to the emperor and his hope that his death would contribute to Japan's victory. The day of the test flight dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the somber mood that pervaded the airfield. The air crackled with tension as the cloned B-29, its kamikaze, wing glinting ominously in the sunlight, taxied onto the runway. Everyone watched anxiously, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and dread. Tanaka stood beside Dr. Ito, his face a mask of grim determination. He felt a profound sense of guilt and responsibility, knowing that he was sending a young man to his certain death. Ito, strangely, seemed detached, his eyes fixed on the aircraft with a clinical curiosity. The engines roared to life, shattering the silence. The cloned B-29 began its lumbering takeoff roll, slowly gathering speed. The aircraft wobbled precariously, its fragile wings straining under the immense weight. For a moment, it seemed as if it would never get off the ground. But then, with a surge of power, it lifted into the air, climbing slowly into the azure sky. A collective sigh of relief swept through the assembled crowd. The aircraft was airborne. Initially, the aircraft performed well. The kamikaze wing, despite its flimsy construction, seemed to deliver on its promise of increased speed and maneuverability. The pilot reported improved responsiveness and a noticeable increase in airspeed. The aircraft soared through the sky, performing a series of aerial maneuvers that showcased its enhanced capabilities. For a brief moment, hope flickered in Tanaka's heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, Project Kurohane could still succeed. But the euphoria was short-lived. As the aircraft climbed higher, it encountered unexpected turbulence. The kamikaze wing, designed for optimal performance under ideal conditions, was ill-equipped to handle the buffeting winds. Cracks began to appear in the wing structure, hairline fractures spreading rapidly across its surface. The pilot reported increasing instability, a disconcerting vibration that grew steadily more intense. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The cracks widened, and the wing began to flex and twist violently. The pilot fought valiantly to maintain control, but the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to handle. He radioed back to the airfield, his voice strained with fear, reporting the imminent failure of the wing. Everyone on the ground held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew what was coming. The inevitable happened with terrifying suddenness. With a deafening roar, the kamikaze wing disintegrated. The cloned B-29, no longer able to sustain flight, plunged towards the earth. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a collective gasp of horror. The aircraft plummeted into the sea, exploding on impact in a massive fireball. The pilot, Lieutenant Kenzo, was killed instantly. The crash site was a scene of devastation. Debris from the aircraft littered the water, and a thick plume of black smoke billowed into the sky. The team members stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and drawn. All their hopes, all their sacrifices had been reduced to ashes. Project Kurohane, it seemed, was finally irrevocably doomed. The dream of a Japanese superfortress had crashed and burned, taking with it the lives of countless people and leaving behind only despair and disillusionment. Tanaka stared blankly at the wreckage, the weight of his failure crushing him. He had sacrificed everything for this project, and in the end, it had all been for nothing. The aftermath of the crash was a scene of utter devastation, both physically and emotionally. The mangled remains of the cloned B-29 bobbed in the waves, a grim testament to the project's failure. The military officials, who had arrived shortly after the crash, were livid, their faces contorted with rage and disappointment. They unleashed a torrent of abuse upon Tanaka and his team. They accused them of incompetence, of wasting valuable resources, and of betraying the emperor. The atmosphere was thick with recrimination and blame. It was clear that Project Kurohane was finished. The officials issued a terse order. The project was to be terminated immediately. All research and development was to cease, and the remaining resources were to be reallocated to other, more promising initiatives. Tanaka, his spirit broken and his mind reeling from the disaster, felt the full weight of responsibility crashing down upon him. He knew that he was to blame for the failure of Project Kurohane. He had made the wrong choices, compromised his principles, and ultimately led his team down a path of destruction. He had failed his country, his emperor, and himself. With a heavy heart, he offered his resignation. He could no longer bear the burden of command, the weight of his own inadequacy. The military officials accepted his resignation without hesitation. They stripped him of his rank, his authority, and his reputation. He was no longer Captain Tanaka, the brilliant engineer. He was simply Masaru Tanaka, a disgraced and defeated man. He was reassigned to a remote outpost in the far north of Japan, a desolate and windswept location where he would be forgotten. In the lonely isolation of his new post, Tanaka had ample time to reflect on the events of Project Kurohane. He questioned his motivations, his decisions, and his actions. He wondered if he had been driven by ambition, by a misguided sense of patriotism, or by a genuine desire to serve his country. He replayed the events of the past months in his mind, searching for answers, seeking some measure of understanding. He realized that he had been blinded by his own arrogance, that he had allowed himself to be swept up in the fervor of war. He had lost sight of his principles, compromised his ethics, and ultimately sacrificed his humanity. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside his window, Dr. Ito arrived at the remote outpost. Tanaka was surprised to see him. He had assumed that Ito, like the rest of the team, had been scattered to the four winds after the termination of Project Kurohane. Ito entered the small, sparsely furnished room and sat down across from Tanaka. He looked tired and worn, but his eyes still burned with their characteristic intensity. He had come, he said, to tell Tanaka the truth. Ito revealed that he had intentionally sabotaged the kamikaze wing. He had deliberately weakened its structure, ensuring its failure during the test flight. He had done so, he explained, because he believed that the kamikaze wing was morally wrong, a perversion of engineering and a violation of human dignity. He couldn't stand by and watch as young men were sent to their deaths on a suicide mission. Tanaka was stunned by Ito's confession. He had suspected sabotage, but he had never imagined that Ito, the eccentric but brilliant aerodynamicist, would be the one responsible. He felt a surge of anger, a sense of betrayal. But as Ito explained his motivations, Tanaka began to understand. He realized that Ito's sabotage was not an act of malice, but a desperate attempt to prevent a greater evil. Ito explained that his sabotage was a form of resistance, a way to strike back against the militaristic regime that had plunged Japan into war. He believed that the war was a senseless tragedy, a waste of human lives and resources. He couldn't condone the use of technology for destructive purposes. He had chosen to sabotage the kamikaze wing, even at the risk of his own life, because he believed that it was the right thing to do. Tanaka and Ito sat in silence for a long moment, each grappling with the implications of Ito's revelation. They both realized that they were trapped in a web of circumstances beyond their control, forced to make impossible choices in a world gone mad. They shared a moment of shared guilt and understanding, recognizing that they were both victims of the war, both casualties of a conflict that had eroded their humanity. The failure of Project Kurohane highlighted the true cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost and resources squandered, but also in terms of moral compromises and the erosion of human values. Tanaka realized that the project had been doomed from the start, not because of technological limitations, but because of the fundamental flaws in its premise. You cannot simply clone technology, he realized. You must also understand the culture and values that created it. The B-29 was more than just a machine. It was a product of American ingenuity, American resources, and American values. Japan, with its dwindling resources, its rigid social structure, and its increasingly desperate ideology, could never truly replicate it. Japan surrendered. The atomic bombs had seared away any remaining illusions of victory. Tanaka, still at the remote outpost, received the news with a strange mix of relief and despair. The war was over, but at what cost? He returned to Tokyo a changed man. The city was a wasteland of rubble and ashes, a testament to the destructive power of war. The suffering of the Japanese people was immense, their faces etched with hunger, grief, and uncertainty. The nationalistic fervor that had once consumed him had dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of disillusionment. He understood the futility of war, the utter senselessness of the violence and destruction. He saw the faces of the young men he had sent to their deaths, their sacrifices rendered meaningless by the ultimate defeat. The story of Project Kurohane faded into obscurity, a footnote in the history of the war. But within the engineering circles, it became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the ethical dilemmas of technological advancement in times of conflict. The project served as an example of how desperation could lead to morally questionable decisions and ultimately, to failure. It highlighted the Importance of ethical considerations in scientific and technological pursuits, especially in the context of warfare. It was a reminder that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory, and that human values and moral principles should always be paramount. Tanaka, haunted by his past, dedicated his life to rebuilding Japan. He used his engineering skills to help construct homes, repair infrastructure, and restore the shattered economy. He became an advocate for peaceful relations with other nations, promoting understanding and cooperation. He sought redemption for his past actions, striving to make amends for the harm he had caused. He worked tirelessly to heal the wounds of war and to build a better future for his country. He became a teacher, sharing his knowledge and experience with a new generation of engineers, emphasizing the importance of ethical considerations and the need to use technology for peaceful purposes. The story underscored the tragic irony of engineering in wartime. The pursuit of innovation, the drive to create new and more powerful technologies, often leads to destruction and suffering. Engineers, driven by their technical expertise and their desire to solve problems, can become unwitting participants in the machinery of war, their creations used to inflict pain and death. The story served as a reminder that engineers have a moral responsibility to consider the ethical implications of their work and to resist the temptation to use their skills for destructive purposes. In his later years, Tanaka often reflected on Project Kurohane, trying to make sense of his experiences. He came to understand that failure in this context was a form of resistance. By failing to clone the B-29, he had inadvertently prevented the creation of a weapon that could have prolonged the war and caused even more suffering. He realized that true strength lay not in technological superiority, but in empathy, understanding, and the pursuit of peace. He realized that copying the enemy required understanding them, something war made impossible. The project was doomed not because of technical limitations, but because of the inherent limitations of a mind consumed by conflict. Tanaka found peace in the knowledge that his efforts, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their initial goal, had contributed to a greater good. He had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the importance of ethical considerations, and the power of human compassion. He had emerged from the darkness of war a wiser and more compassionate man, dedicated to building a better world. His life became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope. In the end, he found solace not in technical achievements, but in the simple acts of kindness and the quiet pursuit of peace. True strength lies not in technological superiority, but in empathy, understanding, and the pursuit of peace. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about innovation and conflict, subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos. We explore the intersection of technology, history, and human experience.